This morning you heard from Belinda and many other people about the importance of having the economic and the political empowerment come together and the importance of being politically empowered. So we are moving now from the economic discussion into the political one. And on stage to lead this discussion, how girls can utilize their voice for political change, I'll start with our moderator, Nahla Ayed. Nahla is a renowned foreign correspondent with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. She has reported from Karachi, Mumbai, Berlin, London, Gaza, Haiti, Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. Having spent time on Parliament Hill, she's the ideal moderator for this panel. So Nahla, welcome. Joining Nahla on stage is Elise Jordan, who is a stellar columnist for the National Review and has focused her reporting and blogging on women in conflict, politics, and foreign policy. Elise is here with us from New York City. Marissa Mazria-Katz is a freelance journalist who was born in the U.S., completed her master's in the Middle East, and will tell us about an interesting initiative she's involved in Morocco. So welcome. And finally, I'm going to pause for a second. I met Katerina, I guess, not even 2 weeks ago, and we had this phenomenal conversation, and I said to her, will you please join this panel? So Katerina Wallenbureau is a managing director with Burson Marsteller and focuses on the European government. She's led pan-European campaigns and has worked with the European Commission. Katerina currently lives in Brussels. Nahla, over to you.
Thank you, Farah. Welcome. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really relieved, actually, to see all of you because last night I had a stress dream. Do you guys get those? Where I had to host a 1-hour music show, 80s music, news, commentary, and sports, and I kept missing the top of the hour. So this is far friendlier. Happy to be here. It's an important panel, and to quote Farah, it's a game changer. It's what all of this is about. It's about how you can use your voice to affect political change, how to find that voice. And we've got a wonderful panel who will hopefully give you some important tips and help in trying to make that happen. And I'm certainly not the expert, but it is something that comes up a lot in my work, because obviously our jobs are to reflect the voices of people of the places that we visit. And it is not an underestimation to say that in virtually every country I've been to, from Haiti to Gaza, to the West Bank, you name it, it is a difficult task to find women who will want to address political issues. And this happens also in Canada. And so as a public broadcaster, we try to reflect all voices, the diversity of voices that are available, men, women, and also different political views. And it is a challenge to find women who can do that. And so again, I'm not the expert. We've got our panel here, so we'll give them each a chance to give us a few minutes of their thoughts, and we'll get the discussion going. So we'll start with Katerina.
Thank you. And yeah, let me just add how very special it is to be here. I've been to a lot of conferences, like I'm sure all my colleagues have, and I don't think I've ever been to such a very special conference full of so very many special people. And I'm very proud to have brought my 2-month-old daughter to a girls' summit, her first conference. So that's great. I just wanted to make 3 observations. I think the ways for women to raise their political voices, for girls and women to raise their political voices, and the challenges to doing so are obviously very different in different regions and indeed in different G20 countries. Some of the challenges are overt and there are legal frameworks that we need to change, and some of the challenges are more covert and indirect, and there are very deeply rooted prejudices about women's role in society in countries where perhaps the legal framework is more favorable. So I'll make 3 general observations based a bit on my communications background and perhaps also my role as a working mother. Firstly, the research that we heard this morning from Dr. Shetty is incredibly important. I think in directing our message to the G20 leaders, not least in a time of economic crisis, the message that empowering girls and women is not only the right thing to do, it's the economically beneficial thing to do with a huge exponential effect on economic growth is clearly a very powerful message. And in communications, we call this evidence-based communications. You have your target audience, you have the message you want to deliver, you build up your arguments, and then what is the research and the evidence behind this? This is what builds a powerful and a credible message. And here we have all this great evidence, and what we need to do, and what women need to do in building their political voices, is to think about how to use that evidence and deliver the political message in the right way. Obviously, this is easier said than done, but the Economist, I think last week, made the point that women's rights doesn't move the general public. And if it doesn't move the general public, politicians aren't interested, because politicians want to do things that the general public care about. But economics does move the general public and politicians, and we need to make that link between women's rights and economics, based partly on some of the great research and the findings we heard this morning. And being strategic in our communications and using that evidence is one step along the way. Another lesson we learn from communications is using ambassadors and advocates for your cause, and I think Dr. Shetty touched upon this as well. It's good to say good things about yourself. It's even better to have somebody else say it about you. So having great male ambassadors on your cause, if you're pushing gender initiatives back home in your countries, I would urge you to have prominent men to join that cause and to raise their voice as well. Related to that, I think, is something that we've also touched upon, which is girls and women need to have the facts on the key issues to be able to move the political debate. So I was interested to hear from Harriet from the UK here, who said she was studying chemistry, but she was one of the woeful few. I was speaking to a friend who's a director at the European Climate Foundation before I came here, and she said, climate change is such a male-dominated subject because it's based on science and all the scientists are men. And if we want to to drive the political debate, whether it's to contribute to solving the problems of the Eurozone or whether it's to contribute to the climate change debate, we need to have the facts at hand and have the right education. And obviously, there is a societal push to drive us into certain areas, but I think we need to be aware of that, take that on board and say, okay, I want to contribute to this debate, and therefore I'm going to make sure that I know what I need to know. The second point I wanted to come to was, okay, we have the evidence. Why is evidence important? It is because it drives real political change. And at the risk of being a bit controversial, I'd like to say, I think women, at least in the developed world or in Western Europe, where I'm working at the moment, have to a certain extent, we've been handed this right to do it all. And I really believe we can do it all. But it's a bit like, okay, thank you, we can do it all. Now we're going to work twice as hard as all the men to do it within the constraints of a society that was developed when we couldn't do it all. And so we're not pushing anymore. We're not pushing to change society to something that we've created. So we have the right to work in this society, but we also have the right to develop it in a way that suits us. And I think this needs to start early on. And there are a range of policies that we can talk about, but whether it's parental leave, teaching early on that gender equality matters, creating workplaces that suit women and men, that haven't been designed only by men and where we're constantly trying to fit in, is very important. And that's where women's political voice can really, really make a difference. The third point I wanted to make was at I think the time is really now. I think we're on the verge of a huge political power shift, which again might sound a bit controversial, but if you look at, I'm from Sweden originally, even though I now live and work in Brussels. Sweden is a very egalitarian country. It has almost half of parliamentarians are women, half of government ministers are women. The whole society is geared towards creating an equitable environment. Although, as I mentioned earlier, there are covert prejudices that exist in Sweden as well. But it hasn't always been that way. And women in Sweden got the vote, you could say, only in 1920. On the other hand, that's soon a century ago. And it's taken a long time for all the benefits to come from that and all the policies that we've now put in place to create an equitable society. If you look at the right to vote as one of the most basic expressions of a political voice, this has only been given to women in some countries over the last decade, for example, in the Middle East. But I am absolutely convinced that it's not going to take anywhere near a century for that to have a huge effect in transforming these societies. And that's partly because of the huge impact of technology and communications today, and we're going to talk more about that. But the changes that took a century perhaps to take hold in Europe can happen, can rip through these societies like wildfire and change things overnight, almost, for women. And if you just look at the great Yes, We Can campaign, that put somebody in power that 10 years ago would have been almost unthinkable, largely due to, or at least partly due to, I don't want to take anything away from the man himself, but partly due to a fantastic viral campaign. So technology and the change in communications is certainly beneficial to our cause and everything that we still need to fight for. So be evidence-based, I would say. Drive for real political change that comes from your inner convictions about what creates a better society. Not, I can do it all, but I'm going to do it within the constraints of what has been given to me. And the time is now. And then finally, I would say that by coming here, you have all already taken a huge step in raising your voices for political change. So congratulations to all of you. And I think there are currently 4 women leaders of the G20. So we just need 6 more from this room, and we have a gender-balanced G20.
I think that deserves
Thanks.
a clap, doesn't it? Thank you. Thanks, Katerina. Next, we've got Elise.
Hi, my name is Elise Jordan, and my background is that right out of college, a few years older than all of our impressive delegates here, I started work in the White House Office of Presidential Speechwriting. And so while I was there, I worked as an assistant, worked my way up to be a researcher, and eventually started writing small speeches, the most illustrious being the turkey pardon, which in the United States is when the president pardons 2 turkeys that are going to be served as Thanksgiving dinner. And so from there, I moved on to the State Department, where I started working as the speechwriter for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and I became more involved in foreign policy and the issues surrounding our diplomacy. And then I moved back again to the National Security Council, and I worked there on communications dealing with Afghanistan and Iraq. And then now currently I decided to stake out on my own and become a journalist and use my own voice to put my opinions out there. And before, as a speechwriter, you're writing for a person whose beliefs that you share and whose policies you advocate, but you're always hidden from view. A speechwriter should never take any credit at all. And so the big difference with becoming a journalist is that your byline is out there and you're defending your position and what you're advocating for. And so just over my short career, it's kind of amazing when I think of how I was working at the White House, and back, I guess it would have been 40 years ago, 50 years ago even, I'm reading a book about the Vietnam War, and you look at who was in that room, and there was not a single woman in a position of power. And cut to today's diplomacy and foreign policy, and with President Obama's decision to intervene, you have a lot of powerful voices in the room who happen to be women, and it's not just an afterthought. And so I think that the challenge for this generation is that you aren't going to just be 1 or 2 or 3 women sitting in the room within your respective countries. You have a chance to really define the debate and not just be a woman. Sometimes it's frustrating in the United States because you hear about the same women over and over and over. And so I think that you're the best and brightest of your respective countries, but you're also going to be star women among a lot of stars. And so that's what I think is so exciting about this opportunity to develop your voice to make a difference.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Marissa, go ahead.
Hello. Well, I wanted to say that you have all struck me as being so eloquent, and I've just been deeply impressed, really. So a little bit about me. I'm a journalist. I've been doing it for several years, reporting from places like Kabul, Haiti, the West Bank, also the Gulf. And throughout those years, I've noticed that I've been basically acting as someone who has a parachute attached to their back. I jump right in, I see what's going on, and then I'm out. And I try to do the best that I can in that really short amount of time to capture the essence of what's happening around me. And, I tried my best, but inevitably, I didn't always get to the heart of a story or to the heart of an issue. And this really struck me in 2009 when I was in Casablanca, which is a a major city in Morocco, which has some of the worst slums in the Arab world. And I visited them to write a story about a man who was working to change the way the young people there live their lives. And I thought, here I go, I'm going in with my parachute, I'm going to see what's happening, and then I'm going to get out there and I'm going to write my story for Time magazine. But something felt really wrong this time around. Something felt like if I don't get in there and try and work with these kids and actually see what's happening, this will just be another story for my CV. And I wasn't really interested in another story for my CV. So, with that in mind, I approached the State Department, actually the embassy in Casablanca, about having these kids start writing about their lives. And they gave me the teeniest, tiniest little grant you can possibly imagine. But it got me out there, and it got me training these unbelievable kids who were about 14 to 20 years old, mostly women, young women. And at first I taught them, traditional journalism tactics, like, the lead, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Like, I was pretty boring and basic, actually. But yeah, good to know. But what happened was when I appealed for the second year, because I didn't feel I was finished, I asked to move it all online. And I said, you know what, instead of writing about big stories in Morocco, can I hear about what you're going through? Can we talk about the details of your life? Now, a lot of these young people did not have roofs over their heads, lived in something called the Hole, which was like about 30 families in one building, cave-like dwellings, no running water, and really no landlord. Only when the rent was supposed to be paid, suddenly there was a landlord. But otherwise, when there's mold and leaks, there's nobody there. And so we started Words for Change, and essentially what it was a group of these kids who each had their own blogs and started to write about the very minute details of their lives, the very simple things that no journalist could ever capture. Not to mention a lot of journalists based in Morocco were too afraid to even go there. So what in terms of getting the message out there and in hopes of influencing, people who made decisions in Morocco, this was the ultimate. This was a direct line to decision makers. It was saying, hey, I woke up this morning, we're freezing, we're drenched. And it was unbelievable, not only to get it out there on the blogs, but to watch these young people feel so empowered. And so confidence is huge, and I think that was one of the things that this blog, which took 2 minutes to set up, gave them. It also, there was this one anecdote I'd love to tell you, which is there were 2 students who were treated very badly in school. Sometimes in this school, in particular, the teachers hit the children. And nobody was really allowed to get up and say how they felt. But with a pad and a pen in hand, these 2 boys in this case went straight up to the principal's office and asked him the question, why are the teachers humiliating us? And this is a question that these people wanted to ask for years. And it was through blogging that they got this chance. And so I think, that's basically the gist of the work that I'm doing, and that's still ongoing. The State Department is still funding.
Thank you very much. Great anecdote. And it sort of brings us to the point in this discussion where we have to identify the problem. And I think everybody here knows the problem, but we'd like to kind of spend a bit of time bit of time sort of outlining the challenges. And so I wanted to ask you guys, what is it about girls, or what is it about society that makes it difficult for girls to have an effective political voice? Katerina, maybe you can start.
Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think obviously the challenges are different in different societies. But looking across, I think one of the things is that women tend to have innately, girls and women are much less likely within themselves to speak up, partly because they've been taught from an early age that it's not necessarily always so good to speak up. And we heard before from some of the panelists that were having the debate here about, why are girls and women not necessarily taught that their opinion counts or matters. I think that stays, obviously, with us. So there are some built-in challenges in the sense that we've taken on board from all the socialization that girls and women shouldn't be stating excessively an opinion, shouldn't be entering politics and trying to run the world because there's so many other people that could do this better. Again, coming back to what I said about driving for political change in a society that's been created by men, there are political networks. They tend to be driven more male, and they're mostly men in the networks. So men know men who promote men, whether it's to go into on an executive board or on a political committee. That's why, and don't need to go into the debate about quotas here, but we talked about that earlier. Quotas can be a good way of at least ironing out some of the imbalances. Then they might be less effective, less interesting, or some of the drawbacks of quotas then become more evident. But it's more difficult for women to go into politics when that politics has less people like her in it already. There's already an establishment which is kind of anti-woman in a way.
But yet when they do get into politics, it is still a challenge for these women to get their voices across. I'm wondering if you can address that a bit, at least because you were
Well, I think that not only are women underrepresented when it comes to actually becoming decision makers, women are really underrepresented on opinion pages. And just out of our delegates here, how many of you read the op-ed page of the major newspaper in your country every day? How many of those columnists that you see writing in on those pages are women? Exactly. And you look at the United States, and in our major newspapers, men are 5 times more likely to be the authors of those columns. 10 to 20% of the columnists are women. So the reverse, it's predominantly men. And I really think it's one of the last public spheres for women to really conquer and to gain equal footing, just because women are by nature more reticent to put their opinions out there. Women don't necessarily see issues as black and white, and when you're arguing an opinion forcefully, you really have to do that, and you have to back it up with facts and stats, and you've got to be published on the opinion pages because that's what decision makers read. So by not being as present on those pages, we aren't making as much inroads in terms of our arguments. And so I would really say that as my evolution from speechwriter to now, I do a lot of opinion writing. I think it's definitely a tough forum because you're putting yourself up for personal attack often. It's a lot, as I said, these issues aren't black and white, and so you might see the merits of another side's argument, but you still have to hold your ground. It also becomes extremely personal at times where your merits as a human being are being questioned because of some particular viewpoint that you might be advocating for. But I think that that's not a reason for women to shy away from the sphere, and I would just encourage you to go forward in that realm, and especially just looking at now, as you develop your issues of interest, as you develop what you're going to advocate for, at your age, there's no reason why you shouldn't be published on a major opinion page, published on a blog, be published in all of these respectable places that do help shape opinion. And so I would really encourage you to not limit yourself just because of what you perceive as the people who should be publishing and contributing on those pages.
And that is a very important point, actually, because you can't really be an effective voice in anything if you haven't defined yourself. And I was wondering, actually, Marissa, if you can talk about that a little bit. When did you sort of realize, what was the point at which you decided how to define yourself, which made you able to express yourself?
Well, I was particularly moved to relocate to the Middle East in 2003 during the Intifada. I thought it was an opportunity for me to, because I have a Middle Eastern background, so I was very interested in going in and actually seeing what was happening. But over the years, the sort of reporting that I developed was because I did originally come from an arts background. I found that the most interesting stories I could tell about the politics of the region was through the arts. And so I kind of feel it's very key that we work with the things that we're most passionate about and that we know about, and not to be deterred by thinking that you're not an expert. In fact, you are all experts sitting here right now. You can write about what you know, and people will want to read it. And that's really, for me, what I'm most passionate about. And for every story that I've ever decided to write, it was always, my inroad was, where am I connected to this? And if I wasn't connected to it, if I didn't feel a spark, if I didn't feel the passion, I didn't write it. I didn't. And I think that's why you guys, you might think you need to do X, Y, and Z before you get to the point where you're writing, where you're on the opinion pages. And I'm here to tell you that you're actually already there.
She's right. Katerina, what was the moment for you? How did you define sort of your voice?
I think being Swedish by origin, born in Africa, grew up in the Middle East, and for the past 10 years I've lived in Western Europe, I've always had this strong sense of, I guess there are two big things that I've always hated. One is racism, the other one is sexism. And I have to say, in all the different places I've been to, I've always felt that the thing that unites so many societies is the great, strong women. So I've always felt very strongly about that issue. I guess today I define myself very much as a working mother, in the sense that I have 3 children. I love my career, and I think, as I said earlier, you can do it all, but it would be so much better if we could do it in an environment that was slightly friendlier and that we had helped design and create. So I guess it's kind of evolved from that earlier background and then towards working and then having children and trying to put it all together.
And it is really about the application, isn't it? I mean, so the question, obviously, now that we've sort of talked about the problem, is how do you ensure that your voices are heard in the political arena? I mean, what's your advice to someone like these lovely young women who are sitting here to get their voices out there so that leaders listen? Anybody? Whoever wants to jump in.
I would just say not to be distracted by all of the, I guess I'd call it white noise surrounding women's political participation. I worked for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who I personally think is one of the most inspiring women in the world to have ever served in public office. And I think it's kind of funny, when she was, I guess it was December 2000, and she was appointed the first female national security advisor in the United States, and the New York Times ran an article about her speculating on what size dress she wore. And would that ever have been written about a Henry Kissinger or about Tom Donilon, President Obama's current national security advisor? No, they're talking about what size dress she fits into, as if that's even relevant to what her job performance will be. And so I think that with women, it's really easy to get distracted by all of the kind of side noise, but you just have to keep focused on your mission and what you're bringing to the table and what you're going to do, and not be pulled down by other people's own insecurities that are surfacing by what they project on you.
There seems to be a microphone problem. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Marissa?
Well, I think that it's interesting that we have, technologically speaking, it's very easy for us to start getting the message out there. I would say I would recommend, and I probably said this earlier, but really sticking to who you are and not writing from who you think you should be or what you think you should be writing about. that always tends to water down and lessen the impact of your message, of the thing that you're most passionate about. And I think that's really the key. And that was what I worked on very seriously with my own students. I often had them come up to me and say, I want to write about things that were so disconnected from their lives. And I would never say no. But when they would do it, the passion would wane. And then all of a sudden they were like, you know what I really want to talk about is my home and where I live and what's going on to the neighbors above and below. And I felt like that, to me, is an amazing starting point. You're surrounded by your subject matter night and day. You've got it at the tips of your fingers. And so I would encourage, especially in the beginning, at this stage in your life, really talking about what you know, because that's what I'm fascinated by.
But, you know, to be devil's advocate for a minute, I mean, everybody's tweeting, and everybody's blogging, and everybody is talking about what they want to talk about. How do you get through and become effective when you've got a world full of messages like that? How do you compete?
Well, I was going to add to what Marissa said about talking about what you're passionate about. I think being passionate, especially in politics and trying to have a political voice, is critical. But it's also critical to be strategic about what it is you're trying to get across. And as I mentioned earlier, it's thinking about, okay, what is our message? And this is not necessarily, grandiose political stages, in your communities or in your school, all depending on who it is you're trying to convince. Who is your target audience? In this case, you're going to be putting together a communique for the G20. So, we're looking at what's the economic evidence that we believe is going to drive them to want to take on board the message about empowering girls and women. But it could be, a local politician or anybody in your communities that you need to convince of something, and where you need to use your political voice. And who is it you're speaking to? What is it that they are most likely going to be swayed by? And what are the best tools and channels that you can use? And any way that you can be innovative, any way that can help you drive that message home will obviously help. But you need to be strategic. A passionate cause, but then strategic in terms of how you deliver the message.
But what about tweeting and blogs? I mean, can you guys give some examples of when they've actually been effective, where individuals were involved? I mean, can you guys think of anything like that?
Well, I think that with the rise of the Arab Spring, a lot of pundits were very skeptical when it started because of the failure of the revolution in Iran, the Green Revolution. And and then a lot of activists from the Middle East have said that no, we actually learned so much from the failures of the Iranian dissidents because over Twitter, over Facebook, through these online mediums, there were a lot of lessons learned. And so they took those lessons and channeled it into their respective movements in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya to some extent. And so I think that there has been, the online mediums have been such a powerful tool in these revolutions, and I think that as technology develops, women just have to be particularly careful what kind of persona they put out there and what kind of information about themselves, just in terms of personal security and being sure to keep your identity safe.
It does raise a lot of issues. We were talking about this earlier. I mean, even things like cyber stalking or people just kind of finding out who you are and not liking what you have to say. Marissa, you had some good advice.
Yeah, I think it's very important to take care of your identity when you're writing. I know, for instance, with the young people that I work with, we use first name basis. We don't reveal precisely where they live. I think because it's so open where they live and they're so vulnerable. And I think that's key to think about, is not revealing too much information. I know it's hard these days because it just seems to be the thing that everybody does. We're always revealing where we are, what we're eating, where we just went shopping, where we're flying to. But if there is, when it comes to for instance, with a blog, there's a way to sort of keep the identity, not to overexpose who you are. I think that's very important.
There have been some examples, actually, in the Arab Spring, at least we were talking about this earlier, where people have 45,000 or 50,000 people following them because they're so interested in what I'm thinking of Shabab Libya. I don't know if you're familiar with this. But I'm just wondering, once these sort of crises calm down, like with the Egypt thing, it happened, it's still going on, but sort of the crescendo is sort of quieted down. How do you sustain your voice? Let's say you did get an audience as someone who tweets or blogs. How do you sustain that voice beyond those sort of crises that happen?
I think that's why it's important to develop a well-rounded platform and where you're still keeping your issues at the forefront, even though it might not be making international headlines, but you're still moving the ball forward with what you care about. For me, I have written a lot about Afghanistan, I've written a lot about women's rights, I've written a lot about Iraq, but that's not really at the top of headlines these days in the United States. So I've kind of tried to dig deeper into other issues I care about based on the same principles that I might be writing about in regards to human rights, but all around the world, and as the political cycle heats up in the U.S., covering the elections and our potential challengers to President Obama to see what those candidates stand for and how they potentially could change the American political scene. So I think that it's just women should have a well-rounded platform and also stay on top of the issues because you never know when your issue will be at the top of the news.
Mm-hmm. And it is all about trust in the end when you're looking at these sources, right? I mean, it's...
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the recent European parliamentary, or like in the most recent elections to the European Parliament in Brussels, female parliamentarians made extensive use of blogs and tweets to draw more attention to themselves. And, not to say that there aren't many male parliamentarians also using blogs and tweets, but it started with, the amount of attention that many of the female politicians got was out of proportion to what they would have done otherwise. But obviously you need to have a political platform that you then stick to and a program like in any political manifesto, a program that you're then going to deliver on. You can't just write about it in your blog or tweet about it, but it's certainly a way to draw attention. We're talking about this as well. In spite of the potential dangers of the cyber world, it's also a relatively gender-neutral playing field, and certainly a way that I think women politicians can communicate in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I just think it's important that if you decide to endeavor into blog writing, that you commit to it. Commitment, I think, is important because if you drop the ball, you're going to lose your audience like that. I mean, it's just that nobody really sticks around for very long anymore, and if they see a lack of commitment, I think you lose them. And so if you keep your content fresh and it's dependable, it's a dependable source for people, I think that's where, you'll build your audience, your voice will grow, and it'll be a sustainable endeavor. Otherwise, I just think people's attention spans are shortening by the day, basically.
Very true, unfortunately.
Yeah.
My business it is.
But I think, sorry, just to add, I mean, the question I think we should be discussing as well, and that you need to ask yourselves is, okay, you perhaps raise a lot of issues through writing blogs and tweets or whatever during the uprisings, but then how do you get governments and the policymakers to take these on board and to keep involving? Sorry,
no, you're right.
I'm actually raising it as a question
Absolutely.
myself. How do you get policymakers to take these issues on board and to keep involving girls and women in the policymaking process? And that's where, again, I guess the innovative solutions and the evidence and all comes together.
So how would you answer that? I mean, because that is a difficult question. I mean, beyond the communique that's going to which is quite a powerful tool, by the way, obviously. But beyond that, how do you get those messages across to the people who, fortunately or unfortunately, actually are the ones in power and who matter?
It needs to be important to them, as we said. So, I mean, again, the message about the economic benefits. How can girls and women in their constituency, how can they become important? Now, in countries, for example, where women are just getting the vote, obviously women are becoming important constituents because, the famous are going to vote with their feet. So, women have to be important in that sense. Then, I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky one. I think looking at different issues, I mean, contributing to issues that are important to different policymakers or governments, so whether it's health, education, technology for that matter, if you can bring things to that discussion in areas where they need to change or develop policy, then that's going to obviously be interesting and help the policymakers as well. it's a combination of give and take often in public affairs.
And so the flip side of that question then is, how do the G20 leaders, let's say, provide room for women like we have here to actually participate and actually be effective, or giving them a better political voice? What would you tell those leaders to do?
Well, I think that these governing bodies traditionally focus on hard power, and there just aren't as many women involved at the policy level in hard power. And so I think that gradually, and we've seen this in recent years, issues of soft power, which referring to co-opting rather than coercion, have become more in the forefront. And I think that that includes women just by the subject and topic matter. But I also would encourage women not to shy away from hard power, economic, military, might issues, just because your input is so critical in those areas. And a lot of the big mistakes we've seen in the world, women have been lacking from the table historically. So,
okay. And Marissa, what advice would you be giving our erstwhile leaders to make, I guess, the political voices of women and girls more effective?
Well, I think it's just about widening the content of what they read or what they know. I think that it's evident that the traditional sources for news are changing and evolving. And in order to be relevant leaders, they need to widen the scope as well. And so that's really where I see this sort of having the most effect.
By widening the scope, do you mean coalitions? Because I think that's another thing that we should add, the coalitions, the advocates, the building, bigger interest groups. So it's not necessarily only, you fighting for something, but trying to mobilize a stronger group or larger group of people that have the same interest, perhaps for different reasons, but are fighting for the same thing.
Yeah.
So just to sort of do a tally, we've talked about coalitions, we've talked about blogging, tweeting. Let's have a laundry list. What else?
and I also think that public-private partnerships are such a strong tool. Look at this fabulous conference that's a nonprofit and public sponsorship event. I don't think that we should always depend on our government to drive the kind of change that's necessary. And I think that in recent years, the public sector has had an enormous amount of good and influence, especially as constituents, as in customers, push for more social entrepreneurship and responsibility.